Her father cast her out for being infertile. A silent trapper carried their son home. The boy was half frozen when I found him. Not dead, close. His lips were the color of creek ice, and when I lifted him out from under the downed spruce where he'd crawled, he weighed almost nothing, like holding a bundle of kindling wrapped in a coat 3 sizes too big. 5 years old, maybe 6. I still don't know how he'd come that far alone. The nearest settlement was 9 miles, and the snow that had fallen 2 nights prior had turned the draw into a blank white nothing. No trail, no landmark, no reason for a child to be there except that he was. I carried him back to the cabin the way you carry something you're afraid of breaking, both arms, slow. That was the winter of 1883, and I had been alone in those mountains for going on 11 years. I won't dress that up. 11 years is a long time for a man to be by himself, and what happens is not that you get stronger. What happens is that you forget, one by one, the things that require another person. You forget how to speak at a normal volume. You forget that food can taste like something if you make it that way. You forget that wood smoke in a room can smell good rather than just function. You are not harder for it. You are hollower. You learn the difference between those two things, eventually. The boy came around by morning. He'd stopped shivering by midnight. Once I'd stripped off the wet coat and gotten broth into him. Not real broth, just hot water with a little salted venison fat dissolved into it. But it was warm, and that was what his body needed. He'd slept the whole rest of the night beside the stove, and I'd sat in the chair across the room and watched his chest move, making sure it kept moving. When he opened his eyes, he looked at me and didn't scream. I'll give him credit for that. I imagine I was a sight. Long beard, scarred hand, the kind of silence a man carries in his face when he hasn't talked to anyone in a week, and before that it was a week, and before that it was a week. But he just looked at me, and then he looked at the ceiling, and then he said, "I'm hungry," and I thought, all right. This one'll live. His name was Caleb. He told me that on the second day, after I'd made real food, cornmeal with dried elk and a little salt, and he'd eaten 2 bowls of it without ceremony. He told me his name, and then he told me that his mother was in trouble, and the word trouble came out of his mouth with a weight no child his age should know how to carry. I asked him where. He pointed south and slightly east, which was not helpful. I asked him what was there. He said a cabin, and then he said the name of the creek it sat on, and I knew it. I'd trapped that drainage 3 years running, half a day's ride in clear weather. In what we had outside the window that morning, closer to a full day, maybe more. I asked him what kind of trouble. He thought about this. He was a careful child, not in a frightened way, in an old-souled way. Then he said, "She's sick and there's no wood and the food ran out." That was all he needed to say. I saddled the roan and put the boy up in front of me, and we rode south-southeast into a sky the color of old pewter. The cold had settled back in after the snow, the kind of cold that gets under your coat no matter how it's buttoned, and Caleb sat against my chest and didn't complain. He told me, unprompted, that he had walked for 2 days. I asked him why he hadn't gone to the settlement. He said his mother had told him not to, that the settlement was where her father lived, and her father had told her she wasn't welcome anymore, and she'd made Caleb promise never to go there. I didn't ask more about that. We rode. The cabin was where he'd said it was, just back from the west bank of the creek in a stand of bare-limbed cottonwood, small, chinked log sod roof, the kind a man builds alone in a season when he's in a hurry. The door was shut, no smoke from the chimney. Wood pile on the south side was down to 3 pieces, and those were wet. I tied the roan and told Caleb to stay on her and keep moving his toes inside his boots. I knocked on the door. Nothing. I lifted the latch. She was in the far corner on a rope-frame bed, wrapped in every piece of cloth she owned by the look of it, a quilt, a heavy coat laid flat, what might have been a saddle blanket. She'd piled it all on herself, and still she was shaking. Not shivering anymore, just the deep structural trembling that comes when a body is running out of options. Fever flush on her face despite the cold. Eyes open but not tracking. I went back outside and split what wood there was, wet as it was, and cut some green branches off the cottonwood because green wood burns slow but it burns, and I got a fire going in the stove with what dry tinder I had in my saddlebag. Then I brought Caleb inside and told him to sit close to the stove and stay there. I heated water. I don't know everything that was wrong with her. I'm not a doctor. I know she'd been without proper food for at least 4 days. I know the cold had gotten into her chest, the way you could hear it when she breathed. I know she was alone and had been alone since. I found out later, the early part of December, which was 6 weeks prior. 6 weeks in a mountain winter with a child and not enough wood and whatever food she'd laid in, which clearly hadn't been enough, because she'd given most of it to the boy. That last part I worked out later. I didn't work it out from her. I worked it out from the look of the pantry, which had a half tin of dried beans and nothing else, and from the look of Caleb, who was thin but not as thin as he should have been if she hadn't been feeding him from her own portion. She came around by late afternoon. I was sitting in the one chair she had, which I'd pulled close to the bed, and I was watching her the way I'd watched Caleb the night before, and she opened her eyes and looked at me and said, "Caleb." Not a question. A statement. She said it in the voice of a woman who has been holding that name in her chest for 2 days, afraid to let go of it. I said, "He's here. He's fine. He's by the stove." She closed her eyes, she breathed, she opened them again. "Who are you?" she said. I told her my name, Harlan Cade, trapper. I said I worked the mountains from the ridge north of her to the basin south, that I'd had a cabin up the draw for 11 years. "You found him," she said. "He found me," I said, which was the truth of it. He'd come close to 9 miles through hard country, and he'd found my cabin because he was looking for someone, and I happened to be the one that was there. She didn't say anything for a while. She was marshaling herself. You could see it, trying to get her arms and legs back under her own management. The fever hadn't broken, but it was lower than it had been when I'd arrived, and she was alert now in a way she hadn't been. Then she said, "His name is Caleb." "I know," I said. "He told me." "He's mine," she said, and there was a quality in her voice when she said that, not defensive, not explaining herself, not asking for my opinion on the matter. Just a woman stating a fact about the world that she intended to hold onto regardless of whatever came next. I said, "I know that too." Her name was Nora Elswick, though she'd stopped using the last name because it was her father's name and her father had made certain things clear about that. She told me all of it over the next several days, as the fever went down and she started eating again. Not all at once, not in any organized way, in pieces. The way people tell hard things when they're still not entirely sure you're someone they can trust, but they're too tired to keep it locked up anymore. She'd been married 3 years ago to a man named Prout. Good man, she said, and I believed her. She said it plainly, without sentiment, which is how honest people talk about people they've actually loved. Prout had died the previous spring. Fever, same as what had taken her now, though worse. She'd nursed him for 2 weeks, and then buried him in the hill behind the cabin they'd been renting from a man in the settlement. Caleb was Prout's boy from his first wife, who had died in childbirth. Nora had raised him since he was 18 months old. Her father was a man named Elswick who ran a dry goods operation out of the settlement and had strong opinions about a number of things. One of his opinions, formed after a doctor in Denver had told Nora she would likely never bear children of her own, something about the way she was made inside, he'd said, as though she were a piece of machinery assembled incorrectly, was that a barren woman was a disappointment and that Prout had been cheated in the bargain, though Prout himself had never once thought so. After Prout died, her father had told her she could come back to his house, but the boy couldn't come with her. The boy wasn't blood. The boy was a liability. The boy was Prute's problem, and Prute was gone, and it was time to think practically. She'd told her father what he could do with his house. She'd taken the boy and what she could carry, and she'd made it out here, to this cabin, which she'd gotten the use of in exchange for mending and washing for the man who owned it during the fall. And then winter had come in hard, and the man who owned the cabin had stayed in the valley with his family and stopped coming up, and she'd stretched the food as long as she could, and Caleb had started to understand that something was wrong before she told him anything, because children understand more than adults think they do, and eventually she'd gotten so sick she couldn't get up off the bed. And she'd told Caleb to go find help, and the only direction she could think to send him that wasn't toward her father's settlement was north, up into the mountains, on the chance that there was someone living up there who might listen. She told me all of that. Then she said, "I don't know why I'm telling you all that." I said I didn't know either. She looked at me across the small distance between the chair and the bed, and there was something in her face I hadn't expected. Not gratitude, exactly. Something more level than that. Like she was looking at me the way you look at a piece of country you've decided you're going to cross, steady and taking the measure of it. I stayed 4 days. I told myself I was staying because she wasn't strong enough yet to be left. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. The other part of the truth was that the cabin had sound in it that my cabin didn't. The sound of the boy moving around. The sound of a woman asking questions. Simple questions, useful questions. What wood burns hot and what burns long? How do you keep a chimney from backdrafting? Which months are the worst for cold in this drainage? She wasn't asking to make conversation. She was learning, storing things. You could see her filing each answer away for the next time she needed it. I found that I liked answering her questions. I hadn't known that I liked that. I hadn't known there was a category of thing that I liked that involved another person's presence. On the 4th morning, I told her I was going back up to my cabin. She said, "All right." I said, "I'll come back down in a week to check." She looked at me, she said, "You don't have to do that." I said, "I know." And that was all that was said about it. I came back in a week. I brought a quarter of a mule deer I'd taken 2 days prior, dressed and wrapped in cloth. I brought a sack of dried beans and another of cornmeal and a brick of hard sugar that had been sitting in my cabin for so long I'd forgotten I had it. I brought an extra quarter cord of wood that I'd split and loaded on the roan's pack, the horse complaining the whole way down. Nora was on her feet. The color was back in her face. She'd fixed the door hinges which had been hanging wrong, and she'd banked the fire the right way, and when I came in she didn't treat it like a rescue. She said, "There's coffee," and she meant it, and I sat down at the table she had, which was just 2 planks on sawhorses, and drank it. Caleb had made himself a collection of stones. He showed me each one and explained what was notable about it. Some of the explanations were made up, I think, but he delivered them with complete authority, and I told him he was right, because he was 5 years old and he'd walked 9 miles through mountain snow alone looking for someone who could help his mother, and he'd earned the right to be right about rocks. I came back the next week, and the week after that. There was no formal conversation about this. I'm not a man who has formal conversations about things. What happened was more like weather. You don't decide what the weather is going to do. You notice what it's doing and you make your plans accordingly. By March, I was splitting her wood. By April, I was fixing the corner of the cabin where the chinking had worked loose. By the time the snow went out in May, I had spent more nights in that valley cabin than in my own, sleeping on the floor near the stove with a roll I kept on the roan, and she had stopped saying you don't have to do that. One evening, it was late April, a clear cold night, the kind you get when the days are finally warming but the dark still bites. We were sitting at the plank table with the lamp between us, and Caleb was asleep on his rope bed in the corner, and she said to me, "What made you stay up in these mountains 11 years?" I thought about it honestly. I said, I didn't know how to be around people anymore, After a while, I stopped trying. She said, "What changed?" I said, "You, both of you." She looked at me for a long time. The lamp was between us, and it was a cheap tallow candle in a tin dish, and it wasn't much light, but it was enough. Enough to see her face, and the way it went soft at the edges but not weak. The way a strong person looks when they let something in they've been holding back. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine. Her hand was rough. Her knuckles were chapped from cold water and work. She didn't hold my hand the way a woman does in a story. She just put her hand on top of mine and left it there, and she looked at me, and what I saw in her face was something I hadn't seen in a very long time, maybe hadn't ever seen directed at me the way it was directed at me then. She saw me, not the man who'd shown up useful in a bad situation. Not the mountain hermit she'd been obligated to. Just me, Harlan Cade, 53 years old and 11 years gone from the world, sitting at her table in the lamplight. I'm not a man who cries, but I'm honest enough to tell you that I had to look down at the table for a moment before I could look back up at her. I said, "I'd like to stay." She said, "Then stay." That was it. That was the whole of it. We married in June in the settlement, which I had opinions about, given what her father had done, but Nora wanted it done legal for Caleb's sake, wanted his name in a register somewhere, and that was a sensible thing and more important than my opinions. We stood in front of a judge the settlement had brought in from the county seat for a court week, and Nora wore a dress the color of field sage, which is the color I still see when I think of that day, and Caleb stood between us and held both our hands, and her father was not there because we had not told him and did not intend to. I will tell you about the moment with her father because it happened, and because it shaped what came after. He found out naturally. A settlement is a settlement and word travels. He came out to the valley cabin in late June, on a horse that cost more than the cabin was worth, and he stood in the yard, and he said what he'd come to say, which was that Nora had made herself a fool, and that the boy was not her son, legally or otherwise, and that she was throwing her life away on a trapper who would die in the mountains someday and leave her with nothing. He said all of that with me, standing in the yard 12 feet from him. I let him finish. Then I said, "You can get back on that horse." He said some more things. I said, "The next time you speak about my wife or my son the way you just did, I will not ask you to leave." He looked at me for a long time. I am not a man who makes threats. I think he could see that. What I'd said was a statement of fact, not a promise of violence, but men like her father understand facts when they're delivered plainly. He left. He did not come back. In July, Nora and I went up to my cabin in the mountains for 2 weeks, the three of us, the first real time the two of us had had together in that space. She had wanted to see it. I had told her there wasn't much to see, and that was true. It was a working trapper's cabin, small and functional, smelling of cured hide and pine pitch, but she walked around it like it mattered. She looked at the pegs where I hung my gear and the shelf where I kept the few books I had, and the window that looked north up the drainage. She stood at that window for a long time. Then she said, "You were up here all those years looking out this window." I said yes. She said, "I'm glad we found you." Not glad you found us. Glad we found you. The difference in that, the way she put it, as if it had been a search on both ends, I've thought about that more times than I can count. She had a gift for saying the thing exactly right, not making a ceremony of it, just saying it and meaning it. Caleb turned 6 that August. I made him a bow from a green ash branch, which took me a week to get right, the right flex, the right string tension. He shot arrows at a target I built from a hay bale we'd brought up from the valley, and he hit it eventually, after a good deal of missing, and every time he missed he calmly picked up the arrow and tried again, and every time he hit he looked at me to see if I'd seen, and I always had. There is a thing that happens when a child looks to see if you've seen. When that look is aimed at you specifically, not at the room, not at the general adult presence. It means something. It means you are the one whose witness matters to him. I don't know when I became that for Caleb. Somewhere in those valley months, in the splitting of wood and the answering of questions about wood and the sitting at the plank table drinking coffee, somewhere in there, I had become the one whose witness mattered. I know what that is worth. I know it in a way that men who were handed that value at birth might not. I was a man who had been alone in a mountain for 11 years, and before that a man who had not been seen clearly by anyone for a long time, not since my own mother, maybe, who died when I was young. I had lived most of my life being useful in a functional way, being capable, being the man who knew how to survive the country, and none of that had ever felt like enough, because it had never been offered back to me as something that mattered to another person. Nora changed that. Not because she needed me. She didn't need me in the desperate way, not anymore. She'd survived those 6 weeks alone with Caleb barely, but she'd survived them. She was the kind of woman who was going to find a way through. What she chose was different from need. She chose to let me in when she didn't have to. She kept choosing it every day in the ordinary ways, the question asked because she wanted my answer, the coffee set out because she'd heard me coming, the look across the table when Caleb said something funny, offered to me first, as if the laugh meant more if I was in on it. It is something to be chosen like that. For a man who has spent 11 years forgetting what that feels like, it is not a small thing. We lived in the valley through the fall, and I trapped the mountain drainage through the winter, coming back every 10 days or so, and Caleb came up with me once in October, just the two of us, a 3-day trip. He carried his own pack. He didn't complain about weight or cold. He slept in the cabin and helped me check line in the mornings and carried himself with a steadiness I recognized, because it was the same steadiness his mother carried, the kind built out of not having had things easy. One morning on that trip he woke up before me, which I hadn't expected. I sleep light, always have, habit of years alone in the mountains where things come in the night that need attending to. But I'd slept hard, and when I came around he was already up, already had the stove going, was standing at the north window looking up the drainage the same way his mother had stood there. I sat up, I watched him. He didn't know I was awake yet. He stood at that window for a long time, just looking at the mountain. Then he turned around and saw me watching, and he said, very matter-of-factly, "I looked after the fire." I said, "I see that." He said, "Mom says if you bank it right at night, you don't have to start over from scratch." I said, "Your mother's right." He nodded, satisfied, and sat down to wait for the water to heat. I lay there in the bedroll for another minute, looking at the ceiling, listening to the stove tick. Outside it was still dark, just going gray at the edges. The boy sat quiet and patient the way he'd sat in front of me that first morning in my cabin, 9 miles from nowhere, eating 2 bowls of cornmeal without ceremony. I thought, this is my son. Not by blood. I understand what by blood means, and I am not confused about it. But by the long dailiness of it, by every morning of wood split and every question answered, and every arrow loosed at a hay bale, by his mother choosing to let me in, and his face turning to find mine first when something happened that mattered, by carrying him out of the snow that first night and not putting him down since. That's what I mean when I say mine. We came down from the mountains in November, and Nora had the cabin warm and supper on, and she looked at the two of us when we came through the door, trail dirty and cold, and she looked at us the way, I don't know how to say it except exactly, the way a woman looks when what she has is what she chose, and she'd choose it again. She put her hand on my face when I came in, just for a moment, her palm against my jaw, cold from being outside cutting wood, and she looked at me. Her eyes were brown, Nora's eyes, the kind of brown that has gold in it when the light is right. She looked at me and then she said, "You both look terrible." And Caleb said, "We look like trappers." And she laughed and I laughed, and that laugh went up into the rafters and stayed there. I think about that laugh sometimes. In the mornings when I wake up before her and the cabin is quiet and her breathing is beside me and the boy is asleep on his rope bed and the stove has a few coals left from the night. I think about all the mornings I woke up in the mountain cabin alone, the silence so complete you could hear the snow settle on the roof. And then I think about that laugh, and how it is still up there in those rafters somewhere, and how the rafters of this valley cabin are full of sounds now that I did not know I was missing. A man can live a long time not knowing what he's missing. I was 53 years old and 11 years alone, and I had made my peace, I thought, with the shape of my life. I thought the shape of my life was finished, that I had gotten as much of it as I was going to get, that the quiet was just what life was. Then a boy came out of the snow. Then his mother looked at me across a lamp on a plank table and put her hand over mine. Now it's morning and they're both here, and that's all there is to say about it. That's the whole of it. The shape of my life turned out not to be what I thought it was. A good woman and a boy who came 9 miles through the cold found me in the mountains and brought me back down. I would have said I wasn't lost. I would have been wrong.